A wall 80 times higher than the Great Wall of China was discovered in Siberia. Blocks that weigh 3,000 tons were assembled perfectly into a wall that is over 3,900 feet high. And while geologists say it's natural, there's a big rectangular shape that was cut out from the wall that made the side of the wall look like an entrance big enough for a 10-foot being to casually walk through it. All these and more leave us with questions that science can't fully explain. Who built this wall? And how did they perfectly move 3,000-ton blocks hundreds of feet up in the air? These are just some of the questions left behind by the puzzling megaliths of Gornaya Shoria. And in this video, we will uncover the answers that'll make you rethink our origin as humans. For almost half a century, there were murmurs about a city of giants hidden somewhere in Russia. More specifically, it was rumored to be in Siberia, where plenty of unexplained events were unfolding. In 1908, a mysterious explosion flattened 80 million trees. And here's the kicker, it left no crater. No one knew what had happened, but the explosion revealed something that flipped our understanding of human evolution. What was discovered in the cave was a toe bone, and this toe bone subsequently led to the discovery of a humanoid species that used to live more than 200,000 years ago. Let's take a moment to think about this discovery. Think about it, there was an entire humanoid species like Neanderthals that we had no idea about. And had that bone not been found in a Siberian cave, we would have gone on without ever learning about its existence. Maybe there were other undiscovered species that went undiscovered in that region. So when stories of giants started to pour out of Siberia with the toe bone as proof, a few researchers decided to investigate the so-called city that proves their existence. Modern science has not confirmed the existence of giants, but it could be proven wrong with new evidence. But the problem was that the specific area where giants were rumored to have lived was surprisingly off-limits. Armed guards were stationed there, and they kept curious adventurers away from the site. Another thing that kept people away was the sheer remoteness of this place. It was located on a mountain that was 1,100 meters above sea level. But despite all that, researcher Georgy Sidorev decided to find out what all the fuss was about. In 2013, he led an expedition with a team of 19 researchers to investigate the reports of giant structures in the Shoria region in Siberia. When they reached the site, they were blown away by the immensity of the Shoria Wall. Not only was the wall thousands of feet tall, but the individual bricks were too big to have been moved by humans. The blocks were 20 meters long and 6 meters tall, and hundreds of them were stacked up on top of each other to create a wall as high as a mountain. You could mistake the wall for a mountain if it wasn't for perfectly flattened blocks with right-angled and sharp corners. These were clearly separate blocks that weighed thousands of pounds and were somehow stacked on top of each other. This alone would puzzle the scientific community, but then the researchers found something even stranger. As they got close to the megaliths, they noticed that their compasses started acting weird. To understand what was happening, they pulled out a compass and intently brought it close to the wall before pulling it back and then bringing it close. Without fail, every time they brought the compass closer, its needle would turn away from the megaliths. They tried this with multiple compasses and got the same result. The compass would work properly until it was brought close to the giant blocks. As if that was not enough strangeness, while they were up close, the researchers noticed something else. The stones had burn marks, and some rocks were partially molten. This looked like the effect of human activity, since the structure is in a generally cold region. By now, the researchers were astonished with their findings. All signs and data pointed to the Shoria megalith being a man-made wall. But a wall arranged this high with stones that heavy should not exist. Just what was this thing? So far, the heaviest man-moved stones are in Baalbek in Lebanon. The structures there are massive. One of the largest stones quarried in known history is also in Baalbek. It is called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, and it weighs more than 50,000 pregnant women. That's roughly 2.2 million pounds, or 1,000 tons. We're still scratching our heads about the Baalbek stones, but the blocks at Gornaya Shoria seem to be 3 times heavier. This is really important, because we could explain away the stones in Baalbek and the pyramids with ancient mechanics, but not even a machine would be able to lift the Gornaya Shoria stones, which means that maybe our ancestors were much larger and stronger than we thought. Of course, scientists would be the last ones to accept this position, because it can make them look crazy and affect their funding. Remember, it's more important for scientists and academics to appear logical than to be logical. And that's why, despite the Shoria Wall being around for centuries, no one wrote a paper on it. There was all this talk about a giant wall, but no one even bothered to photograph it. But all that changed with Sidrov's expedition. After the Sidrov expedition, photos of the Gornaya Shoria megaliths were released to the public. The sharp right angles got everyone's attention. These could not be naturally occurring. But at the same time, the blocks were too big to be moved by man or machine. So a lot of people wanted to see the megaliths for themselves. When I say a lot of people, I mean people in the area. The story became a sensation, but within Russian borders, because Sidrov was a Russian. Then, a guy named John Jensen, who was on Russian forums, saw the story and brought it to the English-speaking world. Jensen wrote a paper on what he called supermegaliths in Siberia. He also included photographs that he had found on Russian blogs revealing the true immensity of the Siberian structure. The photos began to circulate, and so did the mind-blowing specifics. For starters, the material which these blocks were made from was granite. And granite, by the way, is what pyramids and many other ancient structures are made of. The rocks were flat and had sharp edges, as if they were cut into blocks. Some pictures featured members of Sidrov's expedition standing next to the blocks. Jensen estimated that by size alone, these blocks seemed like they weighed 4,000 pounds. Remember, the Great Pyramid has 80-ton stones, and we still can't figure out how it was lifted. And here we have 3,000 to 4,000-ton stones stacked into a giant wall. So, of course, people are going to wonder how the structure was built. But before that happened, people started dismissing Jensen's claims altogether. Remember, this was the early internet, and a lot of photoshopped images had been circulated with weird stories. One of the most famous ones is this image, which was ultimately debunked. So for many, the Gornaya Shoria blocks were as unbelievable as the giant skeleton images. But there was a difference. The giant skeleton was proven to be fake, whereas the Shoria megaliths were ultimately located, and are now on Google Maps. So no one can deny it anymore. The wall does exist in Siberia. But the question is, why has no one researched it for the last 10 years? No archaeological missions have been conducted, and most academics have remotely diagnosed the structure as a naturally occurring formation without even seeing it in person, almost sounding like there's a cover-up in play. What that leaves us with is theory and speculation. And the first theory comes straight from the locals, who had assumed that the structure was a remnant from an ancient civilization of giants. This is the simplest explanation that the human mind would derive from seeing something that looks like a wall but is too large to have been built by humans. It was built by giants. Yes, believe it or not, but this is the default theory of people who live around the structure, and it's ingrained in the cultural mythology of the region. Tartarians are believed to be ancestors of the Tatars who live in modern-day Russia. According to regional myths, Tartarians were giants who coexisted with regular humans. Depictions of these giants are numerous. But are they authentic? Well, scientists have found no evidence of these giants ever existing. But then again, up until 2010, they had not found evidence of another species, the Denisovans. These were rumored to be the half-giant descendants of the real giants, so of course the scientific community dismissed them as mythical characters. But then they found a toe bone which led to the discovery of a humanoid species that we had no idea about. Some speculate that the Denisovans and the Tartarians are one and the same. The average Denisovan was 7 feet and 10 inches tall, and this was hundreds of thousands of years ago, when the other humanoid species were roughly 5 feet tall. So the stories of giants that developed and were passed down through song and story may have exaggerated the height difference. Or perhaps Tartarians did descend from prehistoric giants. It sounds unbelievable. But then again, look at chickens who evolved from dinosaurs. Hundreds of prehistoric animals were much larger than their modern-day descendants, yet we believe that our ancestors were roughly the same height and weight as us. There are documents describing encounters with Tartarians, and the fact that they happen to inhabit a place where the massive Shoria wall exists further strengthens this theory. If we follow the Tartarian theory to its conclusion, the giants were ultimately wiped out and left behind no monuments, except ruins like the Shoria wall. Russians who claim to be the descendants of Tartarians find a lot of pride in this story. But ultimately, it is just a story until we find evidence, and so far we have no proof of humanoid giants ever walking the earth. And it is dangerous to take myths too literally. The Aztecs are the perfect example of this. They used to believe that their owl god was one of the most dangerous beings who would be summoned only as the last resort in a losing battle. The owl god could not tell the difference between friend and foe and would kill everyone. So throughout their 200-year reign, they never really summoned him. But when the Spanish army closed in and it was obvious that the Aztecs were going to lose, they finally summoned the owl god. Turns out, the owl god was basically just an Aztec dude in an owl costume. They dressed him up like an owl and threw him on the battlefield. The Spaniards got confused when they saw a guy who was high out of his mind and shooting darts while dressed up as an owl. But this obviously didn't stop them. They just killed him, and that ended the Aztec Empire. So yeah, myths cannot be taken as facts. Sometimes they even contradict each other, like in the case of the Baalbek monolith I mentioned earlier. It's called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, and the story around its name goes like this. A pregnant woman found herself without a provider. She went to this giant stone and started pushing it. Of course, the stone did not move, but it got the villagers curious enough to ask the woman what she was doing. She responded that she had the power to move mountains, but her pregnancy had made her weak, and that if the villagers could just feed her till she gave birth, she would repay them by moving the stone. The villagers fed and sheltered her until she gave birth and left the village. She left no trace except her story, which is still associated with the Baalbek stone. The problem is that this story was probably made up because those who quarried the stone already had a mechanism to move giant blocks. They didn't need to feed a pregnant woman in hopes that she could push the stone. All of this proves that when humans encounter something magnificent, they come up with the wildest stories around it. And given that the blocks at Gornaya Shoria are 3 to 4 times bigger than the Baalbek stones, it makes sense that the tales around the structure are also much taller. One story suggests that giants built the wall to protect themselves from another tribe of giants. Another describes an old giant city that was ruined by an all-encompassing flood. But at the end of the day, these are all just stories until we get evidence that we have not yet found. Sure, we can point to gigantic prehistoric creatures and assume that our ancestors rivaled their size, but our current understanding of history suggests that by the time we evolved to have opposable thumbs needed for construction, we were roughly 10 feet tall. And by we, I mean our ape family. Gigantopithecus is the largest ape ever, and it was no taller than a man standing on another man's shoulders. For a humanoid creature to have built these megaliths, it would need to be bigger than a dinosaur. But we do not have any records proving that such a creature ever existed. That said, we didn't have any evidence of the Denisovians until the Denisova cave was explored in Siberia. All it would take for the giant hypothesis to become science is one bone fragment. And maybe, like the Denisovan toe bone, a giant bone might be unearthed in Siberia. Then there is the advanced ancients theory, which covers not just these monoliths, but also other giant structures like the pyramids of Giza. According to this theory, the blocks were moved not by giants, but by advanced technology. And to be fair, this is more believable, because technology vanishes easier than biology. It's possible for today's technology to be wiped out by a cataclysmic event. I mean, we have some gigantic buildings that our descendants might think were made and used by giants. The thing about the advanced ancients hypothesis is that it goes against our current understanding of technological progress. The current consensus is that humans progressed from simple tools in the Stone Age to bronze and metal tools, ultimately stumbling upon simple machines and eventually building advanced technology. But the advanced ancients hypothesis suggests that our ancestors were far more technologically advanced than we give them credit for. They had advanced machines that helped them create massive structures like the pyramids and the Gornaya Shoria wall. But then, at some point, a cataclysmic event wiped out their technology, and humanity went back to a very primitive starting point, and our history only records that. One of the biggest proponents of this theory is Graham Hancock, who hasn't said much about Gornaya Shoria, but he has said a lot about the ancient apocalypse. Hancock suggests that a massive flood or comet impact occurred around 12,800 years ago, and wiped out most prehistoric civilizations. And honestly, it kind of makes sense. The first humans who were biologically similar to us appeared around 300,000 years ago, and we believe that all the progress we have made from stone tools to you watching this video while you have lunch happened in the last 5,000 years. That seems far more unbelievable than saying we went forward and backwards in technology throughout the hundreds of thousands of years that we have been around. Of course, what our prehistoric ancestors' machines and technology looked like, we have no idea. But we know that at a bare minimum, it was capable of building the Great Pyramids. And such technology could have been used to build the Shoria Wall. Plus, the cataclysm part of Hancock's theory is backed by evidence. Flood myths exist in almost every culture. This cannot be a coincidence. There's also evidence of the ocean covering Siberia and Egypt at one point. So at least the old apocalypse part is accepted by everyone. But the current mainstream view is that our ancestors didn't lose their technology in a giant flood. They were always primitive and survived the apocalypse as a primitive people. Then they continued being primitive until the Bronze Age. This version of history is easy to process, but again, doesn't make sense. We had already evolved brains that were the same size as we have today, so maybe a few 100,000 years ago, we had the same sprint towards progress as the last 10,000 years. Hancock believes that the ancient Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, but discovered and appropriated them. Maybe something similar happened with the megaliths in Siberia. Evidence of the structure once having a door reveals that it was used as a wall even if it wasn't built to be a wall by early Siberians. Maybe they discovered it after the ancient apocalypse. The problem with the advanced ancients theory is that it requires a lot of assumptions. Like, if large structures exist, they were made with advanced technology, and if an apocalyptic event happened, it wiped out existing technology. And a lot of it is a story. To be fair, it is a story that makes sense, and one that is true to an extent, but where it fails is in the specifics. Because of no historical records, it's literally impossible to be right about specifics. And Graham Hancock was proven wrong about Göbekli Tepe, which he tried to position as a pyramid to make a forced point about pyramids and energy. Once you start off wanting to prove a point, you're no longer looking for the truth. But since we are looking for the truth, we'll move on to the next theory, the alien theory. Did you really think we were going to discuss an unexplained structure without aliens? Whenever there's something we can't explain, there are people who attribute it to aliens. According to them, extraterrestrials built the super megaliths in Siberia. We don't need to prove this statement with fossils because we can say that the aliens just left the planet. And believe it or not, that's a weakness of this theory. In science, you need to make falsifiable claims that stand a test and prove their mettle. Gravity exists, and it can be tested by dropping objects. That is science. The closest thing we have to evidence for ancient aliens is depiction of alien-like beings in early carvings. But remember, our ancestors used to carve men with heads of lions, and those didn't exist. So saying aliens built something and left based on a weird carving is a reach, and its biggest counter is that not even Siberians believe it. It isn't a part of their myths or legends. Plus, the strange alien-like carvings aren't even from Siberia. Plus, why would the aliens need to build a random wall in Russia? It doesn't even make sense as a story. But believe it or not, the actual science behind the Shoria wall is even crazier than the alien theory. The scientific view is that these structures, wait for it, simply showed up. So, our land is built on a bunch of massively irregularly shaped rocks that don't stay in the same place. When these plates collide, we have earthquakes. And sometimes, the plates can move in such a way that land gets pushed up, creating mountains. So literally every mountain that you know of was created by this phenomenon across thousands, if not millions of years. Not very hard to believe, right? Nature can throw up a triangular shape and we see no problem with it. But the moment that shape is rectangular, it's suddenly impossible to believe that it just showed up. Now, before explaining the science behind this, I want you to know in advance that even this explanation doesn't cover everything, because there's a mystery at the end of it. So let's start with the fact that geometric shapes are everywhere in nature. So nature can make some pretty amazing things. And just because it is magnificent doesn't mean that it was man-made. This applies to many structures, including rock formations. Shoria megaliths are just one of those. Here is another formation with a very geometrical erosion. If this formation was close enough to a body of water, these cracks would have separated into individual blocks, because water would move through the softer layers and turn this single formation into a stack of individual blocks. As you can see in this picture, rocks can get divided pretty neatly without human intervention. Now, this is what scientists say happened at Gornaya Shoria. And if you zoom out enough, you can see that this structure looks more like a mountain that's been taking Ozempic than an actual wall. So it's basically a cluster of slim mountains with geometrical erosion and nothing more, all natural. But I said that there was a mystery at the end. Well, here it is. Right at the bottom of one of the Shoria megaliths is a door. Mountains and rock formations can have rectangular faces, but they don't have perfect rectangular gaps that are wide enough for a gate. My guess is that the structure occurred naturally, but then humans used it as a protective wall. They carved a rectangular hole and fitted it with a gate. So people have used the megaliths as a wall, but they didn't build it. That's my position. But what do you think? Do you stand by the giant theory or the advanced ancients theory? I believe in the advanced ancients angle, by the way, but I just think that this formation wasn't their doing. They were probably responsible for the pyramids though, and I've made a video about that, so make sure to check it out.